Once again, Hollow Creek had this strange way of creeping under my skin without warning. Most days, I barely noticed how silent the marshes were or how the twisted branches of old cypress trees arched overhead like crooked fingers. But on that particular afternoon, the entire island felt different, charged, like the land itself was waiting for something to unfold. The air clung thick and heavy, laced with a tension I couldn't quite name. I remember stepping off the worn dirt path in front of my house, my friend Sam close behind. We did this all the time, wandering through the woods, poking around the creeks, searching for shells or arrowheads. Usually, there was something comforting about the towering ferns and moss-draped limbs. But that day, the sky looked washed out, and the damp, earthy scent had turned sickly sweet. Everything felt a little too still. Even Sam, who normally cracked jokes nonstop, barely said a word. The deeper we walked, the more I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced something or someone was watching us. The undergrowth rustled now and then, but whenever we spun around, nothing was there. No startled birds, no stray dogs sniffing around the brush, just emptiness. It was like the woods had decided to hold their breath and see how far we'd go. Then, from somewhere ahead, a voice called out, "Help! Help me!" It sounded like someone our age. I froze, uncertain whether my ears were playing tricks on me. Sam and I locked eyes, startled. There was something wrong about that cry. Sure, goats from the nearby farms could mimic human voices, but this wasn't that. This was raw, desperate, someone who needed saving. My first instinct was to rush forward, even though common sense screamed at me to stay put. I wasn't sure if it was fear or some reckless sense of duty driving me, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The thought of turning away seemed worse than any danger ahead. I told Sam we had to check it out. His expression was a mix of doubt and fear, like he couldn't decide whether to talk sense into me or follow along. We made a quick decision to sprint back to my house first. It wasn't far, just a short run over damp leaves and tangled roots. The plan was simple. Grab a knife for safety, maybe a couple of sturdy sticks, and then head straight back. Even at our age, we knew this was a reckless idea. But that voice, it demanded an answer. Inside the house, I grabbed what we needed. Looking back, it was a mix of bravado and naivety. Two kids, gearing up like explorers, chasing after an unknown cry without telling a single adult. My heart pounded as we stepped outside again, into the same heavy stillness. Only now, our own fear was louder, buzzing in our heads. The silence swallowed everything except for the crunch of our footsteps. Sam kept shooting me nervous looks, waiting for me to change my mind. But I pressed forward, convinced we could handle whatever was waiting for us. Off we went, deeper into the twisting vines, guided by a voice that faded in and out, growing fainter. That worried me. What if the person was giving up? What if, assuming they were real at all, they were losing hope? My senses felt razor sharp. Every broken twig under my foot sent a chill up my spine. Even my own breath sounded too loud. Sam tried speaking a few times, but the tension swallowed his words whole. In the back of my mind, I wondered if this was how all ghost stories began. Two kids wandering where they shouldn't, ignoring every warning sign. But I shoved those doubts aside. If someone was truly in trouble, I wanted to be the one to help. And if the woods were testing our nerves, I wasn't about to back down first. Still, dread clung to me. The trees, the air, the distant voice. It all felt like part of some elaborate trick. Yet I kept walking, letting that uneasy feeling coil tighter around my chest. Then we reached the spot where we first heard the voice. We stopped, scanning the undergrowth. No footprints, no sign of anyone. And somehow the silence was worse than before, as if the forest was watching, waiting for our next move. Every instinct told me this was something more than just a lost hiker. I should have turned back, but I was already too deep in, too hooked by the mystery to let it go. Sam must have realized it too. He let out a shaky breath, tightened his grip on his walking stick, and gave me a hesitant nod. Neither of us spoke, but we both understood we'd crossed some invisible line. The forest had claimed us now. We pushed forward, the voice guiding us into an unfamiliar part of the woods. The trees here were strange, their vines twisted into bizarre shapes, loops, symbols, even letters. Some of them looked like markings I'd seen in an old folklore book. Others were so unnatural they made my stomach knot. But a few contained the first letter of my name, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for me. The silence deepened. No birds, no insects, not even a whisper of wind. I felt watched, observed from every shadow-draped trunk. I kept scanning the trees, searching for whoever had called out. But there was nothing, only those eerie symbols leading us further. Eventually, we reached a tree larger than any I'd seen before. The trunk was massive, wide enough to take several people to wrap their arms around. A ring of smaller trees crowded its base, forming a natural barricade. It looked intentional, like the forest had shaped it this way on purpose. Sam mumbled something about turning back, and my legs trembled with a surge of fear. But I pressed on, telling myself we were too far in to stop. Then, at the far side of the trunk, we saw it. A narrow gap in the brambles, like a doorway lined with thorns. We squeezed through, scraping our arms and ankles in the process. The moment we crossed that threshold, the light dimmed. It was still daytime, but the air felt darker, heavier, like the sun had abandoned this place. My chest tightened, but I couldn't turn back now. Some reckless force inside me pushed me forward, desperate to see what lay ahead. Beyond the overgrowth was a clearing, charred black, as if burned long ago. The ground was cold beneath my fingers when I reached down to touch it. In the center stood a tree, half its original size, scorched and split down the middle. At its base was a hollow, a gaping, pitch-black opening just a few feet from the ground. A bad feeling crawled up my spine. Something about that hollow was wrong. Too dark, too empty. My pulse hammered. Then, from deep within the burned-out tree, the voice echoed once more. "Help! Help me!" Hearing those words come from the lifeless trunk made my stomach twist in terror. I whipped around to see Sam's face had gone pale. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. We ran. Branches clawed at our skin as we tore through the woods, blind with fear. We tripped over roots, stumbled through brambles, not caring where we ran, only that we got away. We didn't dare look back. Somehow, by sheer luck, we burst from the woods and landed right back in my driveway, far from where we had entered. My lungs burned. My mind raced. I still clutched the knife I'd grabbed, but now it felt useless. We never told anyone. Maybe we were scared people would believe us too easily. After all, everyone around Hollow Creek had their own eerie tale. But this one we kept to ourselves. And ever since that day, every time I pass the tree line, I brace myself. I wait, half expecting to hear that voice again, calling me back. I was certain it would be the perfect day for a winter hunt, the kind of morning that held the promise of something unforgettable. The drive to Pine Hollow Park was oddly silent, aside from the heater rattling against the cold and my German Shepherd, Duke, panting in the back seat. Every few miles, I glanced over my shoulder to check on him, making sure he was just as eager as I was. He always seemed to sense when we were heading somewhere with open spaces and crisp air. Stepping onto the snow-covered trailhead, I noticed how the frost shimmered under a pale gray sky. A deep stillness blanketed everything. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots breaking the quiet. The sharp chill in the air sent a shiver through me, but excitement drowned out any discomfort. Duke tugged at his flimsy, retractable leash, nose to the ground, already on the trail of something. The cheap plastic handle felt weak in my grip, and I made a mental note to replace it. At first, the woods felt peaceful, but then I spotted odd tracks in the snow. They were larger than the fox prints I usually saw in these parts. My pulse quickened, and Duke seemed locked onto the scent. I told myself it was probably just a stray dog or a lone coyote passing through. Winters in the Midwest had a way of making even familiar animals feel like ghosts. Duke's energy spiked, and despite the little voice in my head warning me to stay calm, I encouraged him. hyping him up to find whatever was out there. A bad move. He was already worked up, and my words only pushed him further. Before I could react, the flimsy handle of that cheap leash started to bend. I gripped it tighter, but Duke gave one powerful pull and the cord snapped. In an instant, he tore off between the trees, kicking up clouds of powder. My heart pounded as I shouted for him, but my voice seemed to dissolve in the silence. For a second, I stood frozen, watching my dog vanish into the wilderness. Then my body jolted into motion, and I plunged after him, trudging through snow that deepened with every step. His tracks were spaced wide, his bounding strides impossible to match. The forest felt larger, colder, more unfamiliar now that I was alone. My breathing turned ragged, both from the chase and the creeping worry tightening my chest. If Duke ran into a coyote or something worse, he could get hurt. And if I lost his trail, I might never find him again. The deeper I went, the more unease settled over me. The trees loomed taller, their branches heavy with snow, yet nothing stirred. No shifting limbs, no scurrying creatures. The silence had changed, no longer peaceful but eerie. I kept expecting something to dart out from the shadows. I called Duke's name again, my voice cracking. Somewhere ahead, I heard him bark, but the echo bounced between the trees, warping the direction. I pressed forward, ignoring the ache in my legs. The ground grew treacherous, hidden ice patches lying in wait. A creeping thought gnawed at me. If I lost my footing and went down hard, no one would know where to find me. But adrenaline pushed me forward. I had one goal: find Duke, get a hold of him, and get us both out of here. Just as I caught sight of Duke darting onto a narrow, forgotten path near the creek, I realized how unfamiliar everything looked beneath so much snow. In the summer, I'd walked these trails with ease, but now, ice-coated slopes turned them into hazards. My boots found more slick patches than solid footing, but I barely hesitated. If I lost sight of him now, I might never catch up. The incline ahead was brutal. I tried to move carefully, but Duke was already bounding ahead, his tracks stretching too far apart for me to match in a normal stride. I picked up my pace, and that was my mistake. My foot hit an unseen ice patch, and before I knew it, I was falling. 1 second, I was upright. The next, I slammed into the ground so hard my teeth rattled. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and my vision blurred. Instinct kicked in. I twisted, clawing at the snow for anything to break my slide, but I was moving too fast. Every rock and root bruised me on the way down. My fingers scraped something, a branch maybe, but it snapped instantly. The world became a blur of white and brown until, suddenly, the creek was beneath me. The ice cracked and I plunged through. The water hit like a punch to the chest, so cold it stole my breath. My muscles seized, my mind reeled, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't think straight. Desperate, I fought to get onto all fours, feeling the icy water creeping up my arms. My soaked clothes clung to me like dead weight. One wrong move and I'd be submerged completely. With a final, frantic push, I managed to slide onto thicker ice near the bank, then crawled, gasping, onto solid ground. That's when the pain in my leg flared. My pants were torn, a deep gash staining the snow red. I tried to stand, but my knee nearly buckled. A sharp, pulsing ache warned me I was in trouble. And with my luck, an animal could pick up the scent of fresh blood. The last thing I needed was a hungry predator trailing me. Then Duke reappeared, completely unfazed, panting like he'd just had the greatest adventure. Relief flooded me, but frustration flickered too. I couldn't risk him bolting again. With shaking hands, I grabbed the broken cord still hanging from his collar and wrapped it around my wrist, securing him as best I could. The cold gnawed at my fingers, and the wind sliced through my wet clothes. Climbing back up the bank became a test of sheer will. Every step was a struggle, the snow soaking into my gloves as I dragged my injured leg forward. The 2-mile trek back to the car felt endless, like crossing some frozen wasteland. The wood's eerie silence did nothing to ease my nerves. Every distant crack of ice made me flinch, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to emerge from the trees. When I finally saw the faint outline of the parking lot, my throat tightened. That battered old car looked like salvation. I nearly collapsed against it, fumbling for my keys, my wet gloves making it impossible to grip anything. Duke hopped into the back seat on his own, tail wagging, while I cranked the heater and stripped off my soaked jacket. My rifle landed on the floor. I wouldn't be firing any shots in this condition. My hands were too numb, my body too battered. I tore into the first aid kit, wrapping my knee with unsteady hands. Warm air blasted from the vents, but my teeth still chattered. My mind kept replaying the descent, the fall, the icy plunge. I sat there, the engine's hum mixing with my racing thoughts. Duke settled in, his eyes half closed, completely unaware of the chaos he'd caused. I kept looking at him in the rearview mirror, feeling a strange mix of relief, frustration, and gratitude. That creek could have been my grave. If I'd hit my head or gone fully under the ice, it might have ended differently. One broken leash, one bad decision, and nature nearly swallowed me whole. I needed to get my leg checked. I needed dry clothes, something warm to drink. But more than anything, I needed to get home, to let the heat of my house drive away the memory of that frigid water. By the time I pulled into my driveway, exhaustion hit like a weight. I couldn't decide if I felt lucky or just plain foolish. But one lesson was crystal clear: winter hunts are no joke. And a single careless mistake can turn a simple outing into a nightmare. I limped to my front door, Duke trotting beside me, vowing I'd never trust a cheap leash with our lives again. I got a late start that night, slipping into my worn hunting gear and grabbing the old single-shot 20 gauge from its usual spot near the door. The sky overhead was deep black. No moon, no distant city glow. Out here, you relied on your own sight, maybe a dim flashlight if you had one. Something about the stillness felt off. Normally, the crickets would be singing in a steady rhythm, with an occasional owl hooting in the background. That night, nothing, just silence. I brought along the dogs, 2 young hounds still getting the hang of things. They were usually eager, darting into the brush, yipping as they searched for a scent. But this time, they were silent. I figured they just hadn't picked up a trail yet. We followed the edge of the property toward a familiar creek. My boots crunched through the undergrowth, every step sounding louder than usual. After about 20 minutes of slow walking, I realized something was wrong. The dogs hadn't barked once. Even if they were chasing shadows, they'd make noise. I whistled. No answer. I called their names. Still nothing. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I kept moving, pushing aside low branches and stepping over fallen logs, expecting the dogs to come racing back. But the silence stayed heavy, like a thick fog. Eventually, I decided to cut across a patch of tall grass toward an open pasture. From there, I could see farther and maybe spot the dogs. The moment I stepped into the clearing, I froze. Across the ridge, a deep red glow stretched through the trees. It wasn't flickering like fire or pulsing like a light, just a solid, unnatural red washing over the treetops. My first thought was a bonfire or someone burning brush, but I couldn't smell smoke. There were no sparks, no movement, just that eerie, endless crimson hue. My pulse hammered. There was no logical reason for that glow to be there. I instinctively ejected the birdshot from my shotgun and slid in a slug. Felt ridiculous. Who loads a slug just to check out a strange light? But something deep in my gut screamed that this was wrong. No one should have a setup like that, especially way out here, far from any road or house. It was like the horizon itself had been painted in blood. For a brief moment, I considered marching up the ridge to see what was causing it. But my legs felt heavy, caught between curiosity and a deep sense of unease. The fear was almost tangible. Something told me that if I got too close, I might not come back the same. Self-preservation finally won out. There's a time to be brave and a time to turn back. I chose the latter. I turned slowly, careful not to make noise. The underbrush rustled beneath my boots, leaves crunching as I made my way back, each sound making me flinch. The only thought in my head was getting home before that light did anything, moved, grew, or worse. By the time I reached the porch, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. Inside, my mom and stepdad were at the table, barely glancing up as I started spilling out my story. They'd heard too many hunting tales over the years, and they weren't about to buy into another one. Instead of asking about the light, they scolded me for leaving the dogs out in the woods alone. I tried to explain, but the words felt empty. They weren't going to believe me. The hounds returned at dawn, looking spooked. They stayed curled up under the porch, refusing to leave their spot. I spent the morning drinking coffee, replaying everything in my head. How could a light that strong leave no sign? No scorched earth, no tracks, nothing? It was like it had never been there. That red glow stuck in my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the treetops drenched in crimson. By midday, I convinced myself I had to go back. I needed proof. This time, I ditched the shotgun for a backpack with water, snacks, and a cheap camera I'd borrowed from a friend. If that glow had left any trace, I was going to find it. As I reached the pasture, my pulse quickened. I expected to see burnt grass or tire tracks, something to prove I wasn't imagining things. But the ground was normal, green, damp, untouched. No footprints, no fallen branches. The forest was alive again. Birds chirping, wind shifting through the leaves. It made no sense. Not far from the pasture stood an old, abandoned house, sagging under years of neglect. Growing up, there were rumors about it, stories of strange lights and whispers in the dark. I never put much stock in them, but standing there, rattled from the night before, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I stepped onto the porch, half expecting the wood to crumble. It held, but let out a sharp creak that made my heart jump. Then movement inside, a shadow quick and unnatural. I peered through a broken window, but the interior was empty, just a long, dim hallway. A deep chill crawled over me. The silence inside the house felt wrong. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a void. I backed away before my nerves made me do something stupid, like break inside. That house had a weight to it, and I was already on edge. By the time I got home, I was itching to tell someone, anyone, what I hadn't found. But as soon as I stepped inside, my stepdad was pacing the floor, his face pale. He met my eyes and blurted out that he had seen the same red glow, except he had been miles away in a different hollow waiting for the dogs to pick up a trail. His flashlight was off when, suddenly, 3 bright red flashes lit up the entire area, so intense he could see every tree and leaf. Then it was gone, leaving him in the dark. I just stood there, stunned. We weren't imagining this. Hearing his story validated what I saw, but it also unsettled me more. Something was happening in these woods. Over the next few days, we asked around, talking to people we trusted. Some had heard stories of strange lights, but no one had solid proof. Theories ranged from military experiments to things beyond our understanding. We didn't know what to believe, but we both felt something was off. I searched online whenever I had access to the internet. Eventually, I found a message board post about a red light sighting 10 years ago, 10 miles away. The person described an object that hovered, shifting colors, but that electric red was the same. I reached out, hoping for more details, but got no response. It made my paranoia worse, like someone wanted the story buried. At night, I found myself staring out the window, waiting for the glow. The dogs were restless, circling the yard with their ears perked. My stepdad kept his shotgun close. We didn't talk about it, but we both felt on edge. One evening, I finally worked up the nerve to go back. This time, my shotgun was strapped across my back. I wasn't taking any chances. The walk felt longer, the night air heavier. When I reached the pasture, I turned off my flashlight and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The moon rose, casting pale light over the hills. But the red never came, just quiet and a lone bird calling in the distance. Eventually, the night chill got to me and I turned back. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to, like I had glimpsed a secret the land had hidden for ages. Part of me wanted to dig deeper, to unravel the truth. but another part whispered that some mysteries are best left alone. Still, as I stepped onto the porch, I made a silent promise. If that eerie glow ever returned, I'd be ready. I've spent my whole life in the northeastern hills of Vermont, surrounded by endless forests and rugged trails that feel more like home than any paved street ever could. My former wife, on the other hand, was a city person through and through. She grew up in the bustling streets of Albany, so naturally, my family thought a weekend of camping, even if just in our own backyard, would be a fun way to introduce her to a quieter way of life. At least that was the idea. My parents' cabin sits on a wide stretch of land, with a small brook meandering behind a thick row of trees. We decided to set up camp just a short distance away, maybe 30 yards at most. It wasn't exactly untamed wilderness, but it had all the rustic charm a city dweller could want. Plus, the pop-up camper we set up was cozy enough to feel adventurous, yet close enough to make a quick run inside if needed. I spent most of that first day giving my ex-wife a full tour. The creek where I learned to fish, the open meadow where deer sometimes appeared at dusk, and the towering maple tree my grandfather planted decades ago. She was enthusiastic, though I could tell this world was foreign to her. Our two Labrador mixes, Duke and Shadow, were having the time of their lives. Duke, the larger of the two, barreled ahead fearlessly, sniffing everything and chasing after anything that moved. Shadow, though usually brave, often waited for Duke's signal before following. Together, they were like an unstoppable duo, tearing through the yard until they were too exhausted to keep going. As the evening settled in, my father approached me with a familiar look in his eyes, the same one he always had before giving me a warning. Sure enough, he mentioned that a rough storm was on its way overnight. Heavy rain, strong winds, maybe even hail. Pretty typical for these hills, but he wanted to make sure we knew it might be safer to sleep inside. Of course, I shrugged him off. We had planned for this, and the pop-up had endured plenty of bad weather before. I reassured him we'd be fine. He just nodded, that silent, "I told you so," already written on his face. When darkness finally set in, the yard took on a different feel. The wind picked up, shaking branches and rustling leaves. Every now and then, the motion sensor lights flickered on, catching something moving. Maybe a raccoon, maybe just the wind, before plunging everything back into darkness. My ex-wife was both intrigued and uneasy. Couldn't blame her. Nights here could shift from eerily silent to suddenly filled with strange noises in an instant. By the time we crawled into the camper, it felt like midnight, though it was probably closer to 11. The dogs settled quickly, exhausted from their play, curling up on their blankets at our feet. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I first registered the sound of raindrops tapping against the roof. It was soft, almost soothing, and I thought it would lull me right to sleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was a thunderclap so loud it rattled the flimsy windows of the camper. My eyes shot open. My ex-wife sat up too, muttering something I couldn't make out over the roaring wind. The rain hammered down, and gusts rocked the camper just enough to make my stomach churn. The dogs, once peacefully asleep, snapped to attention, ears perked. That's when I heard it. Footsteps racing across the gravel path between the cabin and the camper. Not a slow shuffle, but a sprint. I assumed my dad had changed his mind about leaving us outside in the storm. My ex-wife called out jokingly, inviting him in, but no one answered. Instead, there was a loud thump against the camper door, like a heavy fist slamming into it. The entire structure trembled. Duke, normally fearless, shrank back, ears flat, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Shadow pressed close to him, tail low, letting out an uneasy rumble of his own. My ex-wife clutched my arm, and I realized I was holding my breath. Another impact hit the camper, this time from above, producing a deep groan in the fabric. It felt like something had landed on the roof, shifting its weight. The storm raged on, but we could only focus on whatever was out there. Lightning flashed, illuminating the camper for a split second. I caught a glimpse of Duke, eyes wide, staring at the roof. The overhead light outside flickered on, casting a dim glow into the rain-soaked yard. Normally, it would stay lit if something moved nearby, but it shut off almost immediately, plunging us back into darkness. Another heavy thump landed on the roof. The camper swayed again, hard enough that I thought it might tip over. If my dad had been outside, he would have been yelling for us to come inside. But there was only the storm. We needed a plan. We were trapped inside a flimsy camper, completely blind to whatever was attacking it. The dogs barked wildly, but it was clear their anger was mixed with fear. I thought about my dad's hatchet, sitting by the fire pit just a few feet from the door. If I had that, maybe I'd feel safer. But the thought of opening the door without knowing what was waiting sent a shiver down my spine. Thunder boomed again, and the roof creaked. Someone moved above us, dragging across the fabric. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A wildcat? Some lunatic messing with us? None of it made sense. I whispered to my ex-wife that if things got worse, we'd send the dogs out first. Not my proudest moment, but I was desperate. She whispered back that she was ready to run straight for the cabin the second I said go. Lightning flashed again, briefly revealing the fear on her face. I tried to nod reassuringly, but I wasn't sure how we were going to make it through this night. The moment came. I unzipped the canvas door and threw it open. Rain and wind blasted in as Duke and Shadow bolted outside, barking like crazy. I jumped out after them, my feet sinking into the soaked ground. In the next flash of lightning, I saw my parents standing on the back porch, my dad holding a flashlight, his face pale. My mom clutched his arm, keeping him from stepping out into the storm. I grabbed the hatchet and ran for the porch, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The dogs barked toward the trees, but nothing emerged. It was eerie. The yard looked completely empty, yet I knew something had been there. Once inside, we locked the door behind us. My mom wrapped a blanket around my ex-wife, who was trembling on the couch. My dad kept asking what happened, but I barely had the words. Something massive had been on the roof. He tried to brush it off as a branch, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. Morning arrived, revealing the yard drenched and muddy. My dad and I hesitantly stepped outside to inspect the damage. The camper was soaked but still standing. Then my dad pointed at the roof. I climbed up a ladder and froze, for deep impressions scored across the dirt and grime, like something with enormous fingers had gripped the edges to pull itself up. Too big for an animal, too unnatural for a person. My dad muttered something about wind-blown debris, but he couldn't meet my eyes. We packed up quickly. My ex-wife refused to stay another night, and I didn't blame her. To this day, my dad still insists it was just a fallen branch. But I know better. Whatever was out there that night, it was something else. And we got away just in time. I was slumped against the wooden fence at the edge of our driveway, struggling to shake off the grogginess of another dull morning before school. The gravel beneath me shifted, sending a faint vibration through my feet, like something massive was stirring deep underground. Before I could make sense of it, the mailbox beside me rattled so violently I thought it might tear free from its post. My younger brother and sister yelped, and we all stumbled back. The sky was just beginning to brighten, yet the world tilted in a way that left my stomach uneasy. After about 10 seconds of rolling tremors, everything went eerily still. A hush swallowed the yard. No birds, no breeze, as if nature itself had been stunned silent. Dad rushed out the front door, his face tense with worry. He muttered something about the power lines while crouching to inspect the fresh cracks splitting the earth near the porch. Mom hovered in the doorway, her eyes darting between us and the yard. My brother, always the one to make jokes when he was nervous, tried to lighten the mood, but his voice shook. Not even 5 minutes later, Dad's old radio crackled to life with an announcement school was canceled. The roads were likely damaged, and no one was taking risks. I wasn't exactly upset. My sister and I exchanged glances, equal parts relieved and excited. Earthquakes were dangerous, sure, but the idea of skipping class and getting to explore our hillside without adults watching? That was too tempting. Eric, my best friend since we could walk, showed up soon after, practically vibrating with energy. He loved anything unexpected. He didn't even bother knocking, just barged in, shouting about how a couple of chimneys on his street had crumbled. We gathered in the living room, speaking over one another about the quake, wondering if the old trails up by the ridge had collapsed. Even my younger sister, usually glued to her books, seemed intrigued. Dad overheard us speculating about the ridge and immediately shut us down, warning that the tremor could have destabilized the cliffs. Mom backed him up, insisting we stay close to the house. Of course, that only made us more determined. The moment our parents were distracted, my brother, Eric, and I locked eyes. It was time. We slipped outside, telling Mom we'd check around the yard. Technically true, but as soon as we reached the edge of the driveway, we veered toward the trail winding behind the orchard. The morning air was sharp, and the ground felt strangely soft, like the quake had unsettled the soil beneath our feet. Branches littered the path, and every few steps, Eric or my brother pointed out fresh cracks in the earth, some shallow, others deep like open wounds. When we reached the ridge, we were breathless from the climb. Loose stones skittered underfoot, rolling down the slope. One particularly large boulder had dislodged entirely, leaving a raw gash in the hillside. Even from a distance, it looked ominous. A dark wound in the earth, partially veiled by torn roots and damp leaves. My sister hesitated, tugging my sleeve. She didn't think we should get too close. Something in my gut agreed. The way the ground had split open felt wrong. Still, curiosity pulled me forward. What if the quake had uncovered something buried? Eric, always braver than smart, lunged forward, yanking at a tangled mass of roots. He froze, then motioned us over, eyes wide. Beneath the muddy vines and collapsed rocks was a narrow crevice, just wide enough for someone to squeeze through. A strange draft seeped from within, carrying an unfamiliar scent, something between damp earth and metal. My brother wanted to see if it led anywhere, but my sister backed away, crossing her arms tight. Then, from below, Dad's voice rang out, calling our names. He must have guessed we'd ignored his warning. We scrambled from the ridge, slipping on loose stones until we were back on solid ground. Even as we trudged home to face our scolding, my mind clung to that hidden gap in the hillside. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered. That night, while the house settled into uneasy quiet, I lay awake, picturing the shadowy opening under the ridge. How deep did it go? What was inside? The faint metallic scent still lingered in my nose whenever I thought about it. My sister warned me again that sneaking back would be a mistake. Dad had threatened a month's worth of chores if we stepped out of line. But once something sparks your curiosity at that age, it's impossible to ignore. By morning, the plan was set. Eric, my brother, and I were going back. We slipped out with a single lantern and crept toward the opening, hearts pounding with anticipation. The moment we squeezed inside, the air changed. It was thick, stale, carrying a cloying stench that burned the back of my throat. Every breath felt heavy. The tunnel narrowed, roots and damp stone pressing in around us. Then the passage widened into a cramped chamber. In the lantern's glow, we saw them, bones, scattered across the uneven floor. Some were small, likely belonging to animals. Others weren't. Eric gagged, the buzzing of unseen flies filling the heavy silence. I knelt by the wall, fingers brushing over deep scratches carved into the stone. Caught in the crevices were clumps of coarse, dark hair. Something had been down here. At the chamber's far end, the floor sloped downward into a deep, black void. A sudden gust of hot, humid air surged up from the depths, carrying with it a stronger version of that metallic scent. Eric fumbled with a scrap of cloth, soaked it in lighter fluid, and lit it. He held it over the ledge, the flickering light barely piercing the darkness below. Something moved, a fluid shape, just beyond the reach of our feeble glow. It was massive. Then, a sound rumbled from the pit, a deep, guttural growl that sent ice through my veins. And then the roar, a sound so powerful it shook my bones, vibrating through my skull like a physical force. My vision blurred, my breath caught. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. In the flickering light, I caught sight of them. Two eyes, burning red, locked onto us from the abyss. We ran, scrambling up the slippery slope, tripping over rocks, barely able to see through the haze of panic. The ground beneath us trembled with each impossible step. The roar chased us, reverberating through the cavern walls, promising we weren't meant to leave. We didn't stop until we collapsed onto the grass outside, gasping for breath. My brother's face was pale, his hands trembling. Eric was eerily silent, his usual energy drained away. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The horror clung to us, a presence we couldn't shake. That night, sleep didn't come. When I closed my eyes, I saw those burning eyes in the darkness. I heard that roar, felt its weight pressing down on me. Years later, when another small tremor shook our town, I found myself drawn back to the ridge. The cave's entrance had partially collapsed, a jagged scar on the hillside, but that same metallic scent still lingered in the air. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing deep down, the thing beneath was still there, waiting,